Imagine stepping off this massive transatlantic steamship. You are in Europe. It's the year 1900.
Right.
And you are this brilliant, prodigy-level string player from America, and you are just absolutely desperate to master the viola.
Yeah, that's your dream.
Exactly. So you've spent weeks on this boat, heading to the great historic musical conservatories, maybe in Paris or Leipzig, and you're ready to dedicate your entire life to the alto voice of the string family.
A huge commitment.
But then you finally walk through those hallowed doors, you state your intentions, and they hand you a violin.
Oh, man.
Yeah, they hand you a violin and basically say, we don't teach the viola here. That's just like a hobby.
Which is wild to think about now.
It really is. So today we are looking at how an instrument went from this neglected systemic afterthought to an absolute powerhouse. Welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive, specifically curated for you, the students, the teachers, and the performers of the Viola Studio community.
It is such a profound privilege to be speaking directly to this dedicated community of violists today.
We know you are listening, and we've really crafted this exploration entirely for you.
Because the history of this instrument, particularly when you look at the 20th century, it's not just a timeline of dates. It's really a story of biomechanics.
Yeah.
It's acoustic physics, and it's this relentless fight for musical legitimacy.
And the mission today is to explore that pivotal transformation. We're looking at how the viola evolved into a leading voice in the North American classical music scene.
And our roadmap for this journey is incredibly specific.
Yes, it is. We are basing this deep dive entirely on Chapter 16, which is titled The Viola in North America in the 20th Century. And that's from Maurice W. Riley's really comprehensive book, The History of the Viola, Volume 1.
Riley's work is, well, it's essentially the definitive text on the matter.
Oh, absolutely.
It provides the exact dimensions, the pedagogical shifts, and all those critical historical moments that really forged the modern viola identity.
Welcome to Viola Studio. We are a YouTube channel dedicated to the technical, pedagogical, and artistic development of viola students and instrumentalists. In every episode, our goal is to provide a concise and entertaining analysis. We will explore key themes, the messages of the great masters, and the historical context that shaped the sound of our instrument. Whether you are taking your first steps in the alto clef, or you are a professional seeking a new perspective, there is something for everyone at Viola Studio.
Don't miss our upcoming episodes, and remember,
There's always time to explore the history and the heart of classical music.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's go back to that kid stepping off the boat in 1900.
Right, the prodigy.
Yeah. Why on earth would a major European conservatory just flat out refuse to teach the viola as a primary instrument?
Well, because at the dawn of the 1900s, the viola was suffering from a really severe identity crisis.
Oh, so?
The entire classical music infrastructure viewed the viola not as a unique standalone discipline, but just as a secondary skill for violinists.
Like a fallback option.
Exactly. If a violinist was underperforming, or, if an orchestra just desperately needed an internal harmony line covered, a violinist would be handed a viola and just told to figure it out on the fly.
So if you are a student at Viola Studio today, working meticulously on your tone production, think about how wild that is.
It's completely backward.
It's like assuming that because you are a world-class sprinter, you can just automatically enter a hurdling competition without ever practicing a jump. I mean, it completely ignores the distinct nature of the discipline.
That is exactly the systemic blindness of the era.
Yeah.
The assumption was that if you could play the violin, which, generally has a body length of about 14 inches.
Right, which is about 35.5 centimeters for our metric listeners.
Yeah, 35.5 centimeters. So they thought you could simply pick up a viola, which might be anywhere from 15.5 to over 17 inches.
Wow, so like 39 to 43 centimeters. That is a massive jump in size.
It is. But they thought you could just grab it and read the alto clef and be fine.
But the physics of that size difference changes everything.
Right.
I want to make sure we don't just gloss over this for the players listening. What happens mechanically when you add those extra inches to the instrument?
Well, everything shifts. The strings are thicker, they're longer, which requires a vastly different approach to bow weight and bow speed.
You can't just skim the surface.
No, not at all. And the left-hand frame has to expand to accommodate the longer scale length.
What?
If you use a violin vibrato, which is, often rapid and very narrow, on a thick viola C string, it just sounds frantic.
Right, sounds totally choked.
Exactly. A violist needs a wider, more relaxed vibrato to actually get that thicker mass of string oscillating properly. And in 1900, literally none of this was formally taught.
Which brings us to a really crucial question. If the schools weren't teaching it, how did the instrument ever break out of this rut?
It started with the composers, actually.
Oh, really? Not the players?
No, before academic institutions dedicated resources to the viola, visionary composers had to sort of force the issue.
How did they do that?
They began writing parts for the viola that were so undeniable, so prominent, that ensembles had no choice but to find players who could actually do the instrument justice.
Ah, supply and demand.
Yes. And the first major catalyst on our North American timeline is the eminent Bohemian composer Antonin Dvorak.
Dvorak. Okay, now he lives from 1841 to 1904, but what we really care about here is his time in the United States, which was from 1892 to 1895.
Right.
Did he write a concerto for the viola while he was here?
Sadly, no. He did not compose a known solo concerto for the viola during his American residency.
That's a huge bummer.
It is, but Dvorak was actually a very capable violist himself, and he fundamentally understood the psychology of the instrument. What he did instead was hand the viola the absolute spotlight in a way that permanently altered the chamber music landscape.
We're talking about his string quartet in F major, Opus 96.
Yes, famously known as the American Quartet.
This piece is an absolute cornerstone of the repertoire for anyone studying chamber music.
And think about the traditional role of the viola in a classical string quartet up to that point.
Yeah, it was mostly just the rhythmic engine room, playing off beats, filling out harmonies. Very much a background role.
Exactly. But how does Dvorak open the American Quartet? After this brief, shimmering tremolo from the violins, he gives the sweeping, pentatonic opening main theme directly and exclusively to the viola.
For a violist sitting in a chamber group in 1893, that must have been both terrifying and exhilarating all at once.
Oh, absolutely.
You're not hiding in the texture anymore. You're basically driving the bus.
It is a massive psychological shift for the ensemble. The viola introduces the main theme, and it maintains a prominent driving part throughout the entire composition.
And it really requires the violist to project over the ensemble, utilizing the full resonant capacity of the instrument, especially that rich, deep register.
Yeah, Dvorak was basically telling the world, this instrument has a voice that deserves to lead.
Okay, so the composers are starting to push the boundaries and write these demanding, exposed parts. But a great piece of sheet music doesn't magically create great players, right?
Right, you still have to execute it.
You still need an institution to teach the biomechanics we just talked about.
And that takes us past World War I into the early 1920s. This is the moment the structural foundation of the North American viola scene is finally poured.
The concrete gets laid.
Yes. Two major American music schools finally broke with European tradition and formally recognized the viola as a major field of study.
So who were the first institutions to actually take the leap?
The first big breakthrough happened in Rochester, New York at the Eastman School of Music in 1921.
Okay.
They created a dedicated position and hired a man named Samuel Belove as professor of viola and also the conductor of the school orchestra.
Now, Belove is a fascinating figure to me because he perfectly embodies this messy transitional era we're talking about. He wasn't born a viola prodigy, was he?
Not at all. Belove was actually born in Yekaterinoslav, Russia in 1884 and migrated to the United States in 1905.
Okay.
And true to the pedagogical limitations of his youth that we discussed, his formal training was exclusively on the violin. He studied with Professor Heimendahl down in Baltimore, Maryland.
It is amazing that the guy who basically founds one of the first great American viola departments started out as a violinist. How does that transition even happen for him? Does he just wake up one day and decide to switch?
It was a very gradual, highly practical evolution. Belove had this massive, robust Russian string foundation. And as he gained professional experience, he just found himself playing more and more viola.
It's just getting hired for the gigs.
Exactly. He joined the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1908 as a violist and stayed with them until 1920, even serving as the principal of the viola section during his final year there.
Wow. While also playing viola in a bunch of heavy-hitting string quartets, right?
Yeah.
Like the Russian, the Rich, the Kindler, and the Kilburn Quartet.
He was incredibly active.
So by the time Eastman hires him in 1921, he has basically spent over a decade reverse engineering the viola On the job.
Yeah.
At the absolute highest professional level.
Precisely. And he used that hard-won experience to build the Eastman Viola department totally from scratch. He established a pedagogical pipeline that eventually made Eastman one of the most prestigious schools for violists in the entire world.
That's incredible.
He taught there until 1949, creating a lineage so strong that he was eventually succeeded by one of his own former pupils, Francis Tercy.
It is a massive risk for Eastman to invest in that in 1921, but it clearly pays off by creating this permanent lineage. And they weren't alone for long, were they? Just a few years later, another school makes a move.
Right. The Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia makes its own power move. In 1925, they appointed Louis Bailey as professor of viola and chamber music.
And Bailey brings a completely different acoustic and pedagogical philosophy to North America, doesn't he?
He does.
Because Belov has that heavy, deep Russian foundation. But Louis Bailey is described in the source text as an outstanding violist of the French school. What does that actually mean for the listener? How does the French school differ from the Russian approach at this time?
Well, the French school historically placed an enormous premium on elegance, clarity of articulation, and a very sophisticated varied bow technique.
Okay, so it's a bit more refined.
Yeah, where the Russian school might emphasize deep, sustained weight into the string for maximum volume and warmth, the French school often prioritized nuance, color, and agility.
That makes sense.
Bailey came to the United States in 1919 specifically to join the renowned Slonzali Quartet, and he brought that highly articulate sensibility with him.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you suddenly have these two massive academic pillars in the United States, Eastman and Curtis. You have the Russian school and the French school taking root in American soil simultaneously.
And the source notes that while no other American schools followed the lead of Eastman and Curtis immediately, the precedent had been established.
The door was open.
Exactly. Without these two schools formalizing the curriculum, the viola would have just remained a secondary, haphazardly acquired skill.
Okay, so Bailey arrives at Curtis in 1925. But he doesn't just want to teach behind closed doors. He wants to prove to the American public that the viola is a formidable solo instrument in its own right.
He had a point to prove.
And that brings us to a specific night in New York City that I just find absolutely thrilling.
We are zooming in on March 28, 1925.
A landmark date.
Yes, Louis Bailey gave what was very likely the first full recital by an artist violist ever held in New York City, taking place at Town Hall.
The very first full recital. For all the viola studio performers out there listening, just imagine the pressure.
It's hard to fathom.
You are walking onto the stage at Town Hall in 1925, and you are asking a New York audience to sit and listen to an instrument they associate entirely with background harmony for an entire evening.
It was a radically bold proposition, and Bailey understood that he couldn't just play transcriptions of violin fireworks to win them over.
Why not?
Because if he played violin music down a fifth, the critics would just compare him to the great violinists of the day, and the viola would always just sound like a sluggish, inferior violin in that context.
That is such a good point. So what exactly did he play to avoid that trap?
He curated a program that was a literal masterclass in demonstrating the instrument's unique capabilities. He performed works by Strube, Jungen, Hindemith, and perhaps most notably Robert Schumann's Märchenbilder, or fairy tale pictures.
Ah, Märchenbilder. Composed specifically for the viola and piano in 1851. It is full of these incredibly moody, shifting characters that demand an enormous range of tone color.
And that is exactly what the critics seized upon. The reviews from the New York papers the next day are just an absolute goldmine for anyone interested in the historical perception of viola tone.
They didn't just review Bailey's playing, right?
No, they were utterly fascinated by his instrument itself.
Let's look at Olin Downs, the legendary music critic for the New York Times. Downs specifically called out Bailey's instrument in his review, noting that it was one of the finest Gasparo da Salos the writer has had the privilege of hearing.
Gasparo da Salo is one of the earliest and most revered Brescian mastermakers from the 16th century, working over in Italy.
Right.
His violas are legendary, and their physical dimensions are crucial to understanding the sound Bailey was actually producing on that stage.
Wait, let's pause on that for a second. I know Gasparo da Salo instruments are incredibly prized, but how big are they? We talked about the size differences earlier. Are we talking about massive instruments here?
We really are. Originally, many Brescian violas from the 1500s were constructed as tenors, which could be massive, sometimes upwards of 17.5 inches.
Wow, which is like 44.5 centimeters in body length. That's huge.
Over the centuries, many of these were physically cut down and resized to make them somewhat easier to play.
Because 17.5 inches is brutal on the left hand.
It really is. But even the modified Gasparo da Salo violas maintained a very broad model, with wide bouts and deep ribs, which creates an immense internal air volume.
And that internal air volume translates directly into the acoustics Downes is hearing in that hall. Downes wrote that Bailey drew a tone of exceptional fineness and richness of color, praising his substantial knowledge with unusual feeling and control of tonal nuance.
But the most revealing acoustic analysis actually came from the review in the New York Herald Tribune.
What did they say?
The critic wrote, "His lower tones had the characteristic rich mellowness. His higher notes were violinistic, with the slightly cloudy timbre of the larger instrument."
The slightly cloudy timbre of the larger instrument. I love that phrasing so much. It is so vivid.
It perfectly captures the acoustic reality of the viola.
If you were comparing a violin and a viola, I always think of it like the difference between a high-performance sports car engine and a massive diesel truck engine.
Okay, I like that analogy.
The sports car, the violin, is built for high RPM, piercing, brilliant clarity. It just cuts through everything in the mix.
Right, and the diesel truck engine, the large viola, is built for deep, resonant torque. The larger vibrating body of a Gasparo da Salo is naturally optimized to amplify the lower frequencies of the C and G strings.
Right, it pushes a ton of air on the low end.
Exactly. But when you play high up on the A string, that massive body doesn't respond with the same piercing brilliance as a small violin. It produces a thicker, more covered sound.
And what's brilliant is that the critic isn't saying the cloudy timbre is a flaw.
Not at all.
They are acknowledging it as a defining, beautiful characteristic of the larger instrument. The New York Sun echoed this completely, commenting that Schumann's Märchenbilder served Bailey for a display of the rich, tonal beauty afforded by the viola.
Bailey fundamentally proved that the viola did not need to sound like a violin to be successful.
He educated the ear of the New York critics.
Yes, and then he took that triumphant advocacy straight back to his students at the Curtis Institute.
And the roster of students he produced there is just staggering. He served on the faculty until 1940, and he basically seeded the entire mid-century American string scene.
He taught Max Aronoff, who became an institution himself, remaining at Curtis as a teacher from 1926 onward and playing in the Curtis String Quartet.
Right.
He taught Joseph de Pasquale, who went on to a legendary career as the principal violist of the Boston Symphony and then the Philadelphia Orchestra.
And it wasn't just the major symphonies either. One of my favorite details in the source text is Virginia Majewski.
Yes, Virginia Majewski is a vital pioneer in this story. She was one of the first women violists to achieve major success as a soloist and chamber music artist in the United States.
But she didn't stop there.
No, she also forged a massive career as a violist in the Hollywood motion picture studios.
Just think about the cultural reach of that for a second. Millions of people across the globe were unknowingly hearing the refined French school tonal concepts of Louis Bailey every single time they went to the movie theater and listened to a Hollywood soundtrack.
The profound impact Bailey had on the tonal conception of his students is perfectly encapsulated in this incredible anecdote from 1950 involving the legendary cellist Pablo Casals.
Oh, this is the Parade story. Set this up for us, because this is the ultimate validation.
Dr. Bailey had sent a note of introduction for one of his former students who was traveling to meet Casals at the Parades Festival.
Okay.
After hearing the student play, Casals was so moved that he wrote a letter back to Bailey. Casals wrote, "I have never forgotten your art. Never has a violist made such an impression on me. Will we meet again? Let us be happy and thankful that we could, at our age, enjoy music and serve it."
Never has a violist made such an impression on me. When Pablo Casals, who is arguably the greatest string player of the 20th century, says that about your pedagogical lineage, you've successfully changed the history of the instrument.
You really have. However, Bailey's virtuosity and the sheer talent of the students he was producing created a new, urgent problem.
Repertoire.
Exactly, repertoire.
You can't sustain a solo career or an entire academic department just playing transcriptions or even just playing Schumann's Märchenbilder over and over.
As beautiful as it is.
Right. The instrument desperately needed a composer who understood its unique, darker psychology and was willing to write elite, heavy-hitting repertoire specifically for the modern violist.
And that introduces the central composer of our deep dive today, the Swiss-born Ernest Bloch.
Bloch lived from 1880 to 1950.
Right, and he wrote all of his standard repertoire viola works, while living in the United States.
Now, Bloch's origin story is fascinating because it loops right back to that violin-centric prejudice we talked about at the very beginning of the show.
It does. At the age of 16, Bloch went to Brussels to study violin.
And who did he study with?
The legendary violin virtuoso Eugene Ysaye.
But Ysaye was incredibly observant. He looked at Bloch's playing, and more importantly, he looked at some of the young man's early compositions.
Ysaye recognized where Bloch's true genius lay, and he made what might be one of the most important suggestions in the history of viola literature.
What did he say?
He urged Bloch to focus his career entirely on composition rather than violin performance.
The source text literally says, "Violists are particularly fortunate that Bloch chose composition and not violin performance as his life's calling."
And they are.
Because when Bloch migrated to the U.S. in 1916, he basically became the patron saint of the viola.
He began producing absolute masterpieces, starting with his suite for viola and piano in 1919, which he also later orchestrated.
This piece is a titan of the repertoire.
It actually won first prize in the 1919 Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge Chamber Music Competition, which is held at the Berkshire Music Festival.
Let me throw in a quick historical side note from the text that I love here. Do you know who won second prize in that exact same 1919 competition?
I do.
Rebecca Clark, for her sonata for viola and piano. Between Bloch and Clark, 1919 was basically the big bang for 20th century viola literature.
It was an unprecedented influx of high-quality music for the instrument. And the connection between Bloch and our previous protagonist, Louis Badeley, is very direct here.
How so?
Bailey, alongside pianist Harold Bauer, gave the premiere performance of Bloch's suite at that very festival.
But their relationship goes deeper than just a premiere. Several years later, after Bloch had established himself as the director of the Cleveland Institute of Music, Bailey came to Cleveland to give a recital.
Right.
And following that recital on March 25, 1924, Bloch wrote a letter to Bailey. And this letter is essentially a manifesto for the viola.
It really provides profound insight into how a master orchestrator viewed the instrument.
I want to read some exact quotes from this 1924 letter, because for the viola studio audience, this is incredibly validating.
Go for it.
Bloch writes, "The viola has always been one of my favorite instruments, and it happens that, without my knowledge, in my symphonic works and in Macbeth, the viola part is the longest and often most important."
It's a stunning admission of his own subconscious orchestrational bias.
He didn't even realize he was doing it.
His inner ear was just naturally drawn to the alto voice, assigning it the heavy emotional lifting in the scores.
But then he gets into what I call the refuge critique. He writes, "But in my youth, this instrument was neglected and forsaken, and only mediocre violinists were finding in it a kind of refuge."
Which is a brutally honest, first-hand assessment of the European conservatory culture he and Beloved and Bailey all grew up in.
And here is the absolute kicker. Bloch pinpoints the exact mechanical failure of that era. He continues, "The saddest part was that they were trying to play a violin on the viola without understanding that the technique of these two instruments was different. Again, today the viola is unrecognized."
Without understanding that the technique of these two instruments was different. Coming from a world-class composer who studied with Ysaye, that statement is a major paradigm shift.
Let me push on this, because it is so central to what every student at Viola Studio deals with every day in the practice room. We talked about the string thickness and the size earlier.
Yeah.
But why did it take a composer to explicitly state this in 1924? Why was the musical establishment so completely blind to the fact that you can't just apply violin pedagogy to a viola?
It comes down to the inertia of tradition and just the convenience of standardization. For over 2 centuries, the violin had been the undisputed king of the string family.
Right.
It had heavily codified technique, globally celebrated virtuosos, and a massive standardized repertoire. The viola was viewed entirely through the lens of the violin because violin technique was literally the only dominant string language that existed.
It was the only framework they had.
To admit that the viola required a different technique meant admitting that conservatories would have to hire different teachers, develop entirely new method books, and rethink their structural approach to string education.
It's institutional laziness. It took a composer like Bloch explicitly stating the physics are different, and an artist like Bailey proving it on the stage of Town Hall to finally break that 200-year-old paradigm.
Bloch finishes that 1924 letter by praising Bailey directly. He writes that Bailey understands the technique and soul of this magnificent instrument, proving that the viola could express all the scale of feelings and passions with an intensity and color that very few were suspecting.
And Bloch spent the rest of his life writing works to explore that specific intensity and color. We mentioned the 1919 suite, but he returned to the viola powerfully in the twilight of his life.
Yes, there was a significant gap in his viola output, but he returned to it with profound maturity. In 1948, the Juilliard School of Music commissioned a new work from him, resulting in the Concertino for Flute, Viola, and String Orchestra, which eventually premiered in 1950.
Now, this piece is really unique in his catalog, right? It doesn't sound like typical Ernest Bloch.
It is quite distinct. The musicologist David Kushner described the Concertino as a late divertissement.
Okay.
The writing is intentionally simple and transparent. It lacks the heavy, brooding Jewish thematic material that is so common in many of Bloch's other works.
So it's much brighter.
Yeah. Instead, it is characterized by wit, elegance, and taste without attempting extreme profundity. It shows the viola's capacity for lightness and agility.
But then, in that exact same year, 1950, he writes what is arguably his best-known and most frequently performed work for the instrument, the Suite Hebraique.
And this work has a beautiful origin story tied directly to the American viola community. It was composed for and dedicated to the Chicago Covenant Club.
Right.
In December of 1950, the club sponsored a week-long festival of Bloch's works to commemorate his 70th birthday.
And for this festival, the Suite Hebraique was first performed by the Chicago Symphony, conducted by Jan Kublik. And playing the solo part was the principal violist of the Chicago Symphony, a man named Milton Preeves.
And this performance was a total revelation. Preeves' playing was so magnificent, capturing the deep, soulful essence of the Jewish thematic material so perfectly that Bloch was deeply personally moved.
So moved that he didn't just write a thank you note, right? He immediately sat down and wrote 2 additional movements, the meditation and the processional, specifically dedicated to Milton Preeves.
It is the ultimate composer's compliment. They were all published together in 1951, expanding the viola's repertoire with some of its most emotionally resonant music.
But 1950 is a really bittersweet year in this story. It was a year of incredible creative output, but it was also the year Bloch passed away.
It was.
And that brings us to a really poignant artifact of history, his suite for viola solo.
This was one of his very last works, and tragically, it remains unfinished.
The source includes details from his daughter, Suzanne Bloch, and her account is just heartbreaking. She wrote about how his work on the suite for viola solo was interrupted by a major surgery that he never fully recovered from.
Yeah.
The 4th and final movement of the piece just ends, suddenly, on an unfinished phrase.
It is a literal musical representation of a life cut short.
Suzanne wrote that she would bring the manuscript to him in the hospital, urging him to continue writing, knowing how much the instrument meant to him. And he would just smile at her and say later.
Oh, man.
She wrote, "After his death in the hospital, I returned to his bedroom in Agate Beach and found the manuscript on his night table."
It is a profound, almost sacred artifact of viola literature, and it is entirely fitting that decades later at the 7th International Viola Congress, held in Provo, Utah in 1979, the organizers made a major feature of performing all the works written by Bloch for the viola.
That 1979 Congress sounds like a historic event. Suzanne Bloch herself actually opened the Congress with a lecture entitled Ernest Bloch and the Viola.
And the performances of his works were given by a staggering lineup of late 20th century viola titans.
Who was playing?
Isaac Schotten played the Suite Hebraique. Raphael Hillier played the tragically unfinished suite for viola solo. Karen Tuttle played the meditation and processional. Joseph de Pasquale played the 1919 suite for viola and piano. And Milton Thomas played the concertino.
Wow, it was a monumental tribute to the composer who, perhaps more than any other non-violist of his era, understood, defended, and elevated the soul of the instrument.
Okay, so we have established the elite repertoire from Bloch. We have the high-end conservatory training established by Belove and Bailey. The intellectual foundation is totally secure. But let's look at the mathematical reality of the American music scene at the time.
Right, because a handful of conservatory virtuosos in Philadelphia and Rochester do not make a national movement.
Exactly. The United States was experiencing a massive boom in the creation of regional and major symphony orchestras. Who was going to play all the section parts?
You need, what, 10 to 12 violists per orchestra?
Yeah, you need 10 to 12 highly capable violists for every single orchestra. How did America solve its massive nationwide shortage of viola players at the grassroots level?
To answer that, we have to look away from the elite conservatories and look at the American public school system between the 1920s and the 1960s. Following World War I, public schools across the United States began initiating instruction in band and orchestra as a standard part of free public education.
Which is a miraculous cultural development for the country. But as these school orchestras formed, there was a glaring structural flaw in the string choir.
They were totally unbalanced.
Right. They had dozens of violinists, they had plenty of cellists, but viola players were almost non-existent. The string sections were completely unbalanced, lacking that vital middle harmonic voice.
And this is where we meet one of my favorite pragmatic problem solvers in this whole story, Joseph Matti. Matti lived from 1891 to 1967. He was a violist himself and a massive champion of chamber music. In 1928, he founded the National Music Camp at Interlochen, Michigan.
Interlochen, which is still an absolute institution for young musicians today. But when Matti started it, he was trying to assemble a national high school orchestra from the best students in the country.
And he ran into the exact same problem.
Right, a massive scarcity of high school violists. He literally could not form a balanced orchestra.
So what did he do? Did he try to slowly entice them with scholarships? Did he beg them? No. He instituted a brilliant, forceful mandate. He required all violinists enrolled at the camp to play the viola in several concerts.
It is forced exposure. Congratulations on your acceptance to Interlochen on the violin. Here's a 16-inch viola. Learn the alto clef. You are playing it on Tuesday.
I find the psychology of this so fascinating. Why was this brute force method so effective?
Because it completely shattered the fear of the unknown. For a teenage violinist, the viola looks intimidating.
Sure, it's bigger.
It's physically heavier, the stretches in the left hand are wider, and reading the alto clef, where middle C is on the third line of the staff, it feels like trying to read a foreign language while patting your head and rubbing your stomach.
It is a massive cognitive load for a kid.
But by requiring them to do it in a camp setting, Matti forced them to cross that cognitive bridge. Once they experienced the physical sensation of the thicker strings, once they learned the clef, and most importantly, once they sat in the middle of a symphony orchestra and actually felt the power of providing the harmonic engine for the entire ensemble, the stigma vanished.
He got hooked.
They realized playing the viola wasn't a punishment, it was a deeply enriching musical experience.
And the data proves Matti was right. The source notes that following World War II, the viola balance at the National Music Camp gradually improved. By 1960, natural enrollment had completely caught up to demand.
It's a huge victory.
There was finally a sufficient natural enrollment of high school violists to meet the needs of a balanced section, all due to this vastly improved, demystified recruitment throughout the United States.
Joseph Matti essentially engineered a grassroots pedagogical pipeline. But while the grassroots were growing, the absolute pinnacle of orchestra playing was also taking shape. We must look at the professional extreme, the NBC Symphony Orchestra, formed in 1937.
This orchestra is a totally unique phenomenon in American history. The National Broadcasting Company formed an orchestra specifically for the legendary maestro Arturo Toscanini. They didn't hold standard auditions. They essentially draft-picked the finest talent available from around the world to play under the maestro.
Riley's text calls it, perhaps the greatest aggregate of talent ever before assembled in one orchestra. And the viola section was absurdly stacked.
It really was.
Every single player sitting in that section was capable of a major solo career.
I know we could spend an hour just listing the names, but let's focus on a few key players to understand the caliber of this group. You had Carlton Cooley, who later became the principal violist of the Philadelphia Orchestra, producing that massive Philadelphia sound.
You had Milton Katims, a legendary figure who didn't just play, but heavily edited numerous solo works for the viola, standardizing fingerings and bowings for generations of students, before going on to become the conductor of the Seattle Symphony.
And you had Tibor Surly. Surly is a massive name in viola lore, primarily because he is the composer who famously took the sketches of Béla Bartók's tragically unfinished viola concerto and painstakingly deciphered and orchestrated them,
making one of the most important concertos in the repertoire available for publication and performance.
And of course, sitting in the section and frequently performing the major solo parts under Toscanini was the incomparable Scottish violist, William Primrose.
It's like assembling the 1992 Olympic Dream Team, but entirely for the alto clef.
Exactly. So when the NBC Symphony eventually disbanded in 1954, what happened to all this concentrated talent?
They didn't just fade away. They scattered across the United States, taking leading roles as principal players in major symphonies and, more importantly, as professors in universities. They seeded the entire country with the highest possible standards of viola playing.
Which perfectly sets up the massive boom we see in the post-WWII era. Following the Second World War, the United States experiences this incredible renaissance of the arts. Orchestras are extending their seasons from a few months to year-round contracts. They're paying higher salaries.
But the real game changer for advanced students was happening at the university level.
Right.
This is a fundamental shift in the American educational landscape. Colleges and universities aggressively broadened their curricula. They moved beyond just teaching music education or theory. They began granting specific degrees in advanced musical performance.
And a major engine for this growth was the engagement of permanent string quartets in residence.
I want to pause on this concept of the quartet in residence because it elevates the status of the violist instantly. These musicians weren't just visiting artists passing through town. They were granted tenure-track positions. They were appointed as the professor of viola.
It institutionalized the instrument nationwide. A student in the Midwest didn't have to travel to Eastman or Curtis anymore to get world-class instruction.
Exactly. The source lists several major examples that formed the backbone of this movement. The University of Indiana brought in the Berkshire String Quartet. The University of Illinois hosted the Walden String Quartet. The University of Michigan had the Stanley String Quartet, and the University of Wisconsin engaged the Fine Arts String Quartet.
And who was populating these university faculties and major orchestras? It wasn't just homegrown talent.
No, the post-WWII era saw an incredible influx of European masters who migrated to the U.S., fleeing the devastation of Europe. The country became a sanctuary and a new home for some of the greatest musical minds of the century.
This immigrant wave vastly enriched the U.S. pedagogical scene, bringing diverse European traditions directly to American universities. From Belgium, you had Robert Corday, the violist of the Paganini and Stanley quartets, who became a highly influential teacher at the University of Michigan.
From Germany, you had Paul Doctor, an internationally famous concert artist who became a cornerstone teacher at the Men's College of Music in Juilliard, and Walter Trampler.
Trampler was incredible.
A world-renowned soloist and recording artist who taught at Juilliard and Boston University, and who was known for his incredibly pure, ringing tone.
You also had Ernst Wolfisch, widely considered one of the 20th century's finest violists, teaching at Smith College, and a fascinating, vital addition from Cuba, Guillermo Parrish.
Guillermo Parrish is such a cool story. He becomes the violist of the Walden Quartet and a professor at the University of Illinois, but he also becomes a massive research scholar, specifically bringing Latin American and Spanish viola music into the North American academic consciousness.
These foreign-born violists became American citizens and made staggering contributions alongside native-born talents. We are talking about guiding lights like Lillian Folks at Juilliard, Raphael Hillier of the Juilliard String Quartet, and William Linzer, who held the crucial post of principal violist of the New York Philharmonic for 31 years.
But towering above all this incredible post-war activity, the source points to one singular dominant figure who changed the physics of the instrument for everyone.
Unquestionably. We must return to Dr. William Primrose.
The source is absolutely unequivocal about this. Riley states that Primrose has been the greatest single influence that brought about the present high standard of viola performance in America.
It is nearly impossible to overstate his impact. Every single violist in the United States and Canada was touched, directly or indirectly, by his work. His concert performances proved that the viola could be as dazzling as the violin.
And his extensive catalog of recordings set the modern acoustic benchmark. He even succeeded Louis Bailey as the professor at the Curtis Institute.
But I want to talk about his teaching and his mechanics. Because if you are a student at Viola Studio right now, the way you hold the instrument, the way you distribute the weight of your right arm to avoid what we call viola shoulder fatigue during a 3-hour practice session, that is Primrose's legacy.
Primrose fundamentally revolutionized the ergonomics of the viola. Remember the refuge critique from Bloch? The idea that mediocre violinists were just struggling with the larger instrument. Primrose solved the mechanical equation. He proved that by utilizing natural arm weight rather than muscular tension, and by finding the exact acoustical contact point for the thicker strings, a violist could achieve blistering virtuosity without physical injury.
He showed it was possible.
He elevated the technical expectation of the instrument to absolute parity with the violin.
So let's step back and look at the landscape by the 1970s. The North American viola identity had been successfully forged. It was this incredible, robust melting pot. You have the refined French school technique brought by Bailey, the heavy Russian foundation from Belov, the global influences of the post-WWII immigrants like Trampler and Parrish, and the overarching biomechanical genius of Primrose.
The viola had the schools, it had the elite repertoire thanks to Bloch and the chamber music of Dvořák, and it had a massive grassroots pipeline of players.
But it still faces structural vulnerability, right?
It did. To ensure its future, to make sure it never slid back into being an overlooked secondary skill, it needed organized institutional advocacy. It needed a dedicated community.
Which leads us directly to the founding of two highly specific critical organizations in the 1970s. First, the American Viola Society.
Originally founded as the Viola Research Society, it began as a chapter of the International Viola Forschungsgesellschaft, or IVFG, based in Germany. The founder and driving force in America was Dr. Myron Rosenblum, based in New York.
The stated purpose of the society in its constitution was to promote, study, and further the research and performance of the viola and its repertoire. And they did this initially by publishing a biannual newsletter.
Before the internet, this newsletter was an absolute lifeline.
Oh, for sure.
It connected isolated violists across the country with new sheet music publications, reviews of recordings, and deep dives into historical lore.
But their most visible and impactful contribution was the sponsorship of international viola congresses on American soil. The very first one in America was held in 1975 at Eastern Michigan University in Ypsilanti.
And the host chairman for that historic event was none other than Dr. Maurice W. Riley, the author of our source text.
This was quickly followed by the 1977 Congress at the Eastman School and the 1979 Congress at Brigham Young University. And it's important to understand, these weren't just casual meet and greets or trade shows.
No, these were serious, high-level academic and performance summits. Participants from around the world gathered to hear seldom-played historical works, exchange pedagogical ideas in panel discussions, and read rigorously researched papers on the acoustics and history of the instrument.
And they didn't just look backward. They aggressively pushed the repertoire forward by commissioning new works. The society actively paid composers to write for them.
They commissioned Clark Eastham's Concerto for Viola and Orchestra, which was premiered by Nathan Gordon.
And they commissioned George Rochberg's incredibly demanding sonata for viola and piano, which was premiered by Joseph de Pasquale at the 7th Congress. They were actively writing the future of the instrument.
However, there was one final massive hurdle. You can have the greatest pedagogical lineage in the world, and you can commission the most brilliant new music, but you still need the physical tools to make the sound.
You need actual violists.
Right. And in the 1970s, the string community was facing an existential crisis.
Yes, which brings us to the second organization founded in this era, the Violin Society of America. Originally called the American Society for the Advancement of Violin Making, it was founded in 1973.
This organization is fascinating, not just for what it accomplished, but for who actually founded it.
Right. This is one of the most surprising details in the whole text.
Yeah.
I was looking at the list of founding members. You have Dr. Albert J. Kaplan, who became the first president of the society. He was an eminent psychiatrist.
You have Milton Koskoff, who is a distinguished lawyer. You have Herbert K. Goodkind, a realtor who happened to be a specialist in the history of stringed instruments.
What is glaringly absent from that list of founders?
Not a single one of them was a professional luthier.
It's a total paradox. Why are a psychiatrist, a lawyer, and a realtor founding a society for the advancement of violin and viola making?
Because they were avid string players and passionate enthusiasts who recognized a looming catastrophic threat to the art form they loved. The source explicitly points out the severe shortage of fine stringed instruments available in the 1970s and the inflated astronomical prices of the old Italian masterpieces.
Let's break that down. If the survival of bowed instrument performance depends on young, talented college students being able to afford an instrument capable of projecting over a modern symphony orchestra, the system was broken.
Yeah, you cannot ask a 20-year-old student at Eastman to go out and buy a 16th century Gasparo da Cello. The math simply does not work.
Exactly. The old Italian instruments were being bought up by wealthy collectors and foundations, pricing musicians completely out of the market. The founders of the VSA realized that the future of classical string playing depended entirely on fostering a new generation of contemporary makers.
The availability of modern, affordable, world-class instruments was essential to the perpetuity of the art. Their common bond was a desire to promote contemporary luthiers by any means possible.
And they worked brilliantly with the American Viola Society to accomplish this. At that historic 1975 Viola Congress in Ypsilanti, the Violin Society sponsored their very first makers competition. And it was limited entirely, exclusively to violas.
43 newly crafted violas were entered into the competition by luthiers from all over the world. And the source notes that the excellent quality, the sheer acoustic power of the entries was an absolute revelation to everyone attending the Congress.
They awarded gold medals for craftsmanship and tonal quality to 3 young American luthiers who would go on to have massive careers: David Wiebe, Otto Schenk, and David Burgess.
By hosting these rigorous competitions and exhibitions alongside the congresses, the society fundamentally vitalized the craftsmanship of bowed instrument making in America. It gave isolated luthiers a centralized platform to receive expert acoustic criticism, compare their varnish and arching techniques, and crucially, find eager buyers directly among the performing violists.
It closed the economic and artistic loop between the maker and the player.
It is just an incredible journey. When we step back and look at what we've unpacked today from Chapter 16, the trajectory is breathtaking. The viola went from being an overlooked, misunderstood piece of wood, a literal refuge lacking its own technique in 1900, to an instrument with a rich, highly specific pedagogy.
It was forced into the spotlight by the chamber music of Dvorak, given a profound, soulful voice by Ernest Bloch, championed in the great concert halls by virtuosos like Louis Bailey and William Primrose, democratized in the public schools by Joseph Maddie, and finally supported by a thriving modern community of academic advocates and brilliant contemporary luthiers.
It is a story of sheer, stubborn willpower and absolute musical necessity. And for all the students and professionals tuning in from Viola Studio, this is your direct lineage. This is the foundation you stand on every single time you pick up the instrument, negotiate the weight of your bow, and read the alto clef.
Yeah, as we reflect on this century of incredible history, I know you want to leave the listener with a final provocative thought to mull over, looking toward the future of the instrument.
I do. Where do we go from here? For centuries, as we heard in the glowing reviews of Louis Bailey's 1925 New York recital, the tonal ideal for the viola was heavily, almost exclusively influenced by 16th century instruments like his Bresching Gaspero da Salo.
Right.
The critics praised that rich mellowness and the slightly cloudy timbre created by those massive, deep-ribbed bodies. It was the unquestioned benchmark of viola tone. But today, because modern luthiers have been liberated, challenged, and celebrated by organizations like the Violin Society of America, they are no longer just copying the past.
They are innovating.
They're actively experimenting with asymmetrical shapes, ergonomic cutaways, varying string tensions, and radical new acoustic physics.
They are engineering instruments that Louis Bailey couldn't have even dreamed of.
Exactly. So the provocative question is this. Will the sound of the 21st century viola eventually evolve into something completely unrecognizable to the masters of the 19th and 20th centuries? Will that cloudy timbre be replaced by a new, focused brilliance? As contemporary makers continue to fearlessly refine and push the physical boundaries of what a viola can be, perhaps the true, ultimate golden age of the viola's tone isn't locked away in a museum in Brescia. Perhaps it is actually happening right now, on the workbenches and in the practice rooms of today.
I love that. The instrument isn't finished. It is still actively evolving in our hands. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. To everyone in the Viola Studio community, keep practicing, keep exploring the limits of that tone, and keep asking questions about your art. We will catch you on the next deep dive.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope this summary and analysis have been of great help to you. Please remember that this is only a summary and can never replace the book itself. Therefore, we invite you to truly immerse yourself in the work by reading the original text. If this content was useful to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Remember, you can share this video with your friends to help our community continue to grow. Warmest regards, and remember, there is always time to learn and explore the world of classical music. A Viola Studio production.